There we go. Okay, Andrea or Steve, whoever's taking off.
So for the purposes of the recording, I'll introduce myself again. My name's Steve Devlin and I'm one of the interim assistant SEN service managers. I'll be taking you through a brief presentation today about the SEN banding framework, where we are with progress with the SEN banding framework, some key dates and some key points that we think you need to know. Andrew, if you're okay to move on to the first slide. I'll take you through where we are in terms of the progress in implementing the framework, some of the key things that we've learned through the consultation and through our conversation with parents and schools, some of the key issues that we think you'll want to know the answers to, and then at the end of the session we'll have some time for some questions. Now I just need to move the little window somehow because I can't see all of my slides. There we go. Okay, so just some headlines for you, some key points. So County Council's moving to the banding framework model, and this affects top-up funding allocated to education, health and care plans in mainstream schools. So what that means is the framework doesn't apply to special schools, it doesn't apply to resource provisions, even though they are by nature mainstream schools. If a young person is placed in a resource provision, it's got an entirely separate funding arrangement. And banding is primarily to do with funding and the mechanism by which the EHCPs are funded. So it doesn't apply to special schools or to resource provisions. It also, at this point, doesn't apply to early years settings. So for anyone with an EHCP in an early years setting or in a post-16 setting. We'll start to see EHCPs issued from September onwards, where funding allocated to the EHCP is allocated by a band and not by the existing system, which is hours of learning support assistance. Andrew, I'm not sure if that's your mouse or mine, but if you're able just to, there we go, perfect, thank you. So funding for existing education, health and care plans will remain as they are for the time being, and then they will move over to the banding framework over a period of 3 years at phased transfer time. And I'll talk through in detail what that means. One of the key things to separate out with banding is what happens with new assessments and what happens if your son or daughter already has an education, health and care plan. So we'll talk in detail what the plans for that are. The framework itself is laid out in the banding framework document. This is a comprehensive but not exhaustive framework of needs and provision. We know that practice in special educational needs evolves and changes. So it's not an exhaustive encompassing everything framework, but it's reflective of the needs and provision that we see and use these days in SEN and EHCPs. So the document itself is a continuing of the SEND pathway. So schools in Hampshire will be familiar with something called the SEN support guidance, and we know that the majority of young people with SEN will have their needs met at SEN support level without the need for an EHCP. We can just go back, thank you. So a lot of work's been done to make sure that the language and the look and feel of the framework document is a continuation of what schools are used to doing when it comes to implementing SEN support and provision for young people who don't have EHCPs. And then naturally where we go with assessment and when we decide that an EHCP is required to be issued. Okay, so that's our headline key points. We'll do some more key points right at the end because I know there's a lot of burning questions. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next slide. So for the benefit of anybody who is unfamiliar with SEN funding or the framework, I know some of you took part in the consultation and some of you will have been at previous presentations. So some of what I'm talking about won't be news to you, but to take into account that for many people it's going to be, we're going to go right back to basics and we're going to talk about SEND funding again. So pupils with education, health and care plans are funded through a series of elements when it comes to funding. And we're primarily talking about top-up funding, so that top level. So top-up funding means the amount of funds that the local authority release from its high needs block, the money which it keeps on behalf of schools for EHCP spending. So top-up funding is that top element on top of the funding that schools are expected to provide from their general funding. What that means in practice, we refer to elements 1, 2, and 3. So the first portion of the contribution to an education, health and care plan is the general schools funding, so bottoms on seat funding. And that's the first contribution, and that applies to all young people that would attend school. There is an element of funding that comes as part as a formula to general schools funding. The second contribution, you'll quite often hear this referred to as £6,000. So the second portion comes from the school's SEND notional budget. And the SEND notional budget is a budget that comes to schools for meeting broad SEND needs across the whole school. So the contribution in element 2 comes from that pot of money. But we're looking and we're concerned about top-up funding, so that element 3. What's that additional amount of money that the local authority needs to release to that school to deliver the provision in the EHCP? Ready for the next slide? So what is banding all about, really? And this was one of the things that we picked up through the consultation, that although we tried to explain it in lots of different ways, sometimes it was a bit difficult for people to understand from what we'd written what it actually means in practice. So this is one of the infographics that we have pulled together. This, alongside the pyramid that you've just seen, are the visuals that we use in the banding framework document. So we make sure it's very visual and we can explain from a process point of view. But the SEND banding framework essentially is a framework that sets out across the 4 broad areas of SEND and across key stages a range of needs and a range of provision. And it sets it out into different cumulative and increasing levels, different bands. So generally speaking, if an EHCP is required, then top-up funding is generally going to be released a varying amount to deliver that provision. We know that there are some exceptions for this. Sometimes there are EHCPs that are produced that don't attract any additional funding because they don't need to attract any additional funding. But there are specific interventions and provisions that need to be secured in an education, health and care plan. But generally speaking, it's going to release some top-up funding, and that's what our framework helps us to do. So the framework is our tool that helps us to determine how much is needed. So if we think about that as a process, an assessment's agreed, an EHC assessment happens, we seek advice, that advice comes to us in the form of reports usually, and listed in those reports and the advice is going to be a range of needs and crucially a range of provision, what we should put into section F of that education, health and care plan. So along our process, at some point we agree, yes, this young person requires an education, health and care plan. We're going to secure that in section F of that plan, and we're going to compare that against our framework, and we're going to say what level of additional funding is required to deliver the provision in section F. We're going to use our framework as our tool to help us to do that. So we can see as a process how that helps us to do that. And the really good thing about the framework is it's a public document. The framework is out there. When we do issue an EHCP and we do issue a band against it, it's quite transparent where we have allocated funding, how we have come to that decision, because we've assessed it against our publicly available framework. On to the next slide. So what are our bands and how do they increase? What do they look like? So if we think about 4 levels of SEND within the framework, and that means that there's 3 top-up bandings, and our framework will help us best fit the young person into one of these bands. So our first band is our SEN support band. So we've undertaken our assessment and we've looked at a young person's needs and provision, and we've determined that they don't need an EHCP. They're going to be well supported at SEN support level. So they'll fall into the SEN support band. Essentially, we won't issue an EHCP, or we're very unlikely to issue an EHCP. But let's say that that young person does require an education, health and care plan, and our first band is going to be our targeted band. So for simplicity, we're describing our targeted bands, our targeted A and our targeted B, as young people who need some support across the day, including moderate interventions. So why do we have a targeted A and why do we have a targeted B? Why do we have an enhanced A and B? Well, we need some more flexibility. We need flexibility that if a young person falls into targeted, they may be broadly in targeted, but there may be some areas where they're above what would be targeted A. So it would be unfair on that young person and the school not to release sufficient funding if that was the case. So by having A and B within each band, we have more flexibility. Likewise, a young person may not quite meet enhanced A, so the amount of money we would release to a school, they wouldn't need to spend all of that money on that young person. So it might be more appropriate that they fall into targeted B, but all of which is assessed against the framework. So if a young person's needs and the provision that they need are greater than targeted, they're likely then to fall into our enhanced category. So young people who need support across most of their day, which may or may not include complex and frequent interventions. And again, exactly the same approach with enhanced A and enhanced B, giving us that flexibility to increase the amounts. Our very top band is our exceptional band. So for young people who require the highest level of support in a mainstream school. So everything in SEND and to do with EHCPs is evidence-based, but if a young person is going to be in excess of our enhanced B range and their needs are exceptional, we'll have evidence to support that that is the level of funding that that school's going to require. Now, a really key thing to mention is that these aren't restrictive bands. So some of you may have lived in a local authority or worked in a local authority where, let's say, for example, a speech and language service has a bronze package, a gold package, a silver package, etc. Generally, that means that that young person will receive up to and no more than that level of provision in that package. But our bands don't work like that. They're cumulative bands. It doesn't mean that a young person who is on targeted B, if at some point and for a limited period of time they needed a particular provision that was in enhanced A, but they were generally going to be a targeted B, there's absolutely nothing to stop a school using those provisions. There's no expectation that schools cannot go into the higher band. The whole point in having the framework is to support schools with a really wide range of provision to put in to support young people anywhere across the SEN pathway. So moving on to the next slide. Well, why did we change the system? And we were quite clear about this in the consultation, but as a bit of a summary, the current system is called Hours of Learning Support Assistance. And frequently that leads to confusion that means that young person will receive the number of hours allocated on a one-to-one basis, which leads to an expectation on the school that doesn't reflect what that young person's getting. So what do I mean by that? Well, Hours of Learning Support Assistance is a proxy figure. It's an amount of money equivalent to 20 hours of learning support. That doesn't necessarily mean that young person needs or is receiving 20 hours of support. An example may be that funding is released, that's the equivalent amount of 20 hours of learning support assistance. That young person needs and receives 10 hours of support from an adult. They receive 6 or 7 hours of preparation time behind the scenes. They have a very specific intervention that uses the rest of their money. So what we find is that puts schools and parents in a tricky conversation, because the expectation is that that young person is receiving that number of hours on a one-to-one basis. And that was never the basis on which Hours of Learning Support was released in the first place. It is a proxy figure. So we want to simplify that system. We want to make it much clearer that that young person is receiving funding via a band. Now, when it comes to one-to-one support, what we're hoping the framework is going to do is move away from the presumption that one-to-one support is the only way of delivering provision. What I need to be absolutely clear about, and I hope I have been through the consultation in every stage, and in fact, in our banding framework document, there's a very specific statement about this. The framework is not and has never been about removing one-to-one for young people who require one-to-one support. So whether they require interventions or support for some of their day, for most of their day, or for all of their day, or whether interventions need to be delivered on a one-to-one basis, that needs to be clear. But that's not being removed. This isn't a tool to remove one-to-one support from our schools or from EHCPs. What we do want to do is move away from the presumption that one-to-one support is the only way of delivering provision. So commonly, what we might see is when we release an EHCP is a school will say, well, I'm going to use that money to employ someone. Well, that may be what you do. That may be what you need to do to deliver that provision. But EHCP funding isn't by nature there to pay someone's salary or to employ someone. It's to deliver provision for that young person in the plan. One of the ways that a school may do that is they may have to employ someone. And I gave an example to schools of, the very small rural school in the middle of nowhere that has no young people with education, health and care plans and has no learning support assistants. And the only way that they would be able to deliver some of that provision would be to employ someone. It'd be perfectly valid to do that. But that isn't generally the case in schools. Schools, through their whole funding and their learning support assistant arrangements that they've got in place, very rarely is that the case. If the school determines that the only way that or the best way they can deliver one-to-one is to employ someone, they can use their funding for that. But it's not a straightforward, we release an EHCP, you must employ a one-to-one, that's the only way it can be delivered. Because what we see there is a number of things. There's the impact on the young person around their development as an independent learner, and one-to-one being the way and the only way in which they learn. We see the presumption there that that is what we do. I have been to many, many annual reviews over the years where we've talked about a young person's progress, and we've turned and we've looked at the LSA, who's explained how this young person learns. And we know that progress is the responsibility of the class teacher. Quality first teaching is the starting point for all young people. So it's moving away and getting schools, helping them to understand that actually the provision in that young person's EHCP is clear about how they are supported. And in some places it does say, yes, this must be on a one-to-one basis, or this young person must be supported at all times on a one-to-one basis. But it doesn't mean everything needs to be delivered on a one-to-one basis if that is not what's been determined for that young person. So it's supporting us to move away from that presumption. But I need to make it absolutely clear that it is not about removing one-to-one from EHCPs. And there's a very clear statement in the banding framework document to that extent. Okay, we will move on to the next slide, please. So the banding framework as a concept was tested. So in May 2020, a modelling exercise was undertaken with schools. So a 10% of schools, as a cross-section of schools in both primary and secondary, took part in the modelling. We looked at the viability of banding as a concept. We looked at the viability of the values of the bands and would they work. And schools looked at their EHCPs and the number of hours in their EHCPs and grouped them into banding and fed back to us on the viability of this. And we have made quite clear, this was very well received. 94% of the schools that took part in the modelling exercise and the survey fed back to us that this was a viable and very good model. We've been feeding back to schools on some of the things that they told us about the benefits of a banding framework, how it helps them with their whole school approach when it comes to provision mapping for individuals, for classes and across the school. So it has been tested and the feedback was very positive. And then obviously going through consultation, we looked at what came back through consultation across the piece from parents, from public, from different services and from schools as well. So the document itself is a two-part document. It has an introduction and if the visuals that I showed you earlier, so the pyramids, the process, they are the visuals that we're using in the document to explain what banding means, how it's used in the concept of EHC assessments, how it supports decision making for the local authority as part of that EHC process, that it's a publicly available document, that when we band, it's a transparent process. We have been through the process, we have used our systems to band against that, and you can see how we've come to that determination. But the second part of the framework document itself, the biggest part, is the actual framework. There's 40 pages of needs and provision, and those needs and provision are broken down across the 4 broad areas, sensory impairments, communication, interaction, etc. So there's actually 7 different sections across needs and provision. So the same thing happens for need and happens for provision. We set out against key stages where a young person, in terms of their needs or the provision that they require, if that would fall into the SEN support band, if it would fall into our targeted band, or if it would fall into the enhanced band. So it's a very broad document, and the document itself sets out how we navigate our way around that. So it is comprehensive. You know, a lot of work has gone in to make sure that it's a comprehensive document. Partners in educational psychology, schools, parents, specialist advisory teachers, the health service, they have all contributed to this process. So we are confident that this is a good and robust framework. Okay, so moving on. Using the framework itself. So I said really early on in this process, one of the key things for me is that any banding framework, and certainly every local authority I've worked with or worked for, has a banding or an equivalent framework when it comes to their EHCPs. My view was very clearly, well, it's as good as our system, essentially. We can have a framework that's really comprehensive, but if we haven't got a really good, robust and transparent system to determine around that, I don't think it functions as well. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're developing a resource allocation system. Any of you that have worked in other local authorities or may have worked in social care, a resource allocation system is simply the methodology by how you work your way around your framework and how you determine what resource needs to be allocated against that. We're developing our own resource allocation system so that the SEN service can use this as a tool to support their decision making. Now, the key word there is support decision making, not replace decision making. It doesn't replace the SEN services expertise when it comes to looking at reports and judging what resources required against a report. It supports that decision making process. And likewise, when we move existing EHCPs over to band, it supports that process when we're looking at reviews, whether or not any change is required. So the SEN service is receiving its training across July and August in supporting them to use the framework. Now, the whole idea behind this is, it's an extremely busy service, as I'm sure everybody is well aware of. We don't want a system that is going to cause any delays. We want a system that speeds things up and makes things more efficient. So as part of our process that I've already described, when our reports come in and we're looking to draft our EHCP, we run those reports against our resource allocation system, which suggests to us where that young person falls into different bands and gives us a recommendation as to which band. And we agree or we disagree with that professionally. We look at it and we say, well, okay, well, that looks to be right. However, I know this young person, I know I've undertaken this assessment, and I know that actually, you know, for a period of time, this is a transition. This young person might need to be over provisioned while they started at a new school. So we can disagree with our own resource allocation system if we feel fit. But either way, decisions are still subject to moderation within SEN. So if a caseworker is making a recommendation, a special needs officer and an assistant team manager, there's still a process. We do have great ambitions for how we make and ratify our decisions, but they are in the future, and the framework will help us on our journey to get there. So training for the SEN service across July and August. The framework applies, I'll cover this in more detail, but for clarity, if an EHC needs assessment was agreed before April the 1st this year, the framework won't apply. So the assessment will have still been undertaken and the plan would still be issued against the hours of learning support assistance system. It would only apply to new assessments that were agreed after the 1st of April. So what that means, we'll start to see from September onwards EHCPs that have been issued under the framework. The bottom bullet point there, the RAS, our resource allocation system, this includes weighting. So what I mean by this is provision can often look one way on paper, but in reality, when it comes to the point of delivery for a school, it's slightly different. So let me give you an example. Let's say we had a young person who required work to be presented to them in a different way. Well, that seems a simple provision. You have to make these adaptations to this young person's work. But that also means an awful lot of preparation time for that school behind the scenes. So that would attract waiting. Let's say a young person needs an intervention, but they need more than one adult to support them to do that. That would attract a waiting. So what we don't want to do is we don't want to underband a young person because we haven't applied a sensible weighting to our provision. So that's what I mean by our resource allocation system having a weighting attached to it. Okay, so next framework, next band, please. Slide, even. What does the framework mean for you guys as parents? So some of the burning questions that I think you might have today is around, well, if my son or daughter already has an education, health and care plan, what does that mean? Or my son or daughter doesn't yet, an assessment hasn't been agreed, or it has been agreed and it was after the 1st of April. Where does this sit me? What does this mean for me? Well, if the assessment was agreed after the 1st of April, it's going to be issued via a band. So when the EHCP is produced, when it's finalised, communication will be made that this has been issued under a band, and we'll be clear about what that band is. But if your son or daughter already has an education, health and care plan, now let me take you through detail the steps for that. So this is subject to approval. This is what we agree needs to happen, but we need to get this signed off at the highest level, but this is what we are proposing. So just that slight caveat that while I think this is what's going to happen, this is certainly what we want to happen, we do need to get that final sign off. So I'm just caveating that. So existing education, health and care plans, they will continue to have their funding provided under the existing system until next phase transfer. So if you have a child who is in year 1 at the moment, it's likely to be as they move into year 3 that their EHCP's funding will change to banding. Similarly, you know, if son or daughter's in year 3 or 4 at the moment, it will be when they go into secondary school. And of course, if they go into post-16, then it's a different funding arrangement altogether. So at that time, what will actually happen? Well, the funding will change to the closest band. And this is a financial change behind the scenes. So we would look at an EHCP, and if it said 25 hours of learning support assistance, and the closest band alongside that was our enhanced A or our enhanced B, we would move the funding into that band. So it's the closest best fit band. And I can assure you that a school will tell us if they feel that we haven't sufficiently banded. So that's an existing process that happens anyway. If a school feels that we haven't issued enough funding for hours of learning support assistance, they will tell us, and if they have evidence to support that change, we are in position to review that. But what will happen to the EHCP? Well, this is a payment mechanism change. So we're not going to amend the EHCP in terms of banding or hours of learning support assistance. If the EHCP, which has to be amended for phase transfer, if it requires wider amendments based on evidence, that amendment would have to happen. But we're not going to remove hours of learning support assistance. We'll leave that as it's written, and we will simply do behind the scenes a funding change. So the work is with the local authority, it's with the SEN service, it's not with the parent or school. On our system, Capita, which we use, we will simply change over as part of the phase transfer process. We will move the funding arrangement from hours of learning support assistant into a band, and it will affect the funding run behind the scenes. So there's no change. We're not going to take hours of learning support assistance out of the EHCP. But again, that caveat that that's subject to approval. So next slide, please. What does this mean for funding generally? So there will be 2 funding systems running in parallel while EHCPs transfer and transition. So specifically, what do I mean by that? This is the payment run between the county council and schools. So we have said through this process that primarily this is the mechanism by which we fund schools top-up funding. That's been our position, that remains our position, and I hope that's the message that I'm getting across to everybody. So the payment run between the county council and the school will change from hours of learning support assistance through to a band. The school sends notional budget, so that broad budget to me, general needs across the school, That's not affected by the framework. It's entirely out of the scope of what we're doing. The high needs block budget, so the overall budget, that's not directly impacted on by the framework. The high needs block has increased since when we started this process. So this is not a cost-cutting exercise as people have asked through the consultation process. We are not looking to move young people from hours of learning support assistance into a lower band. We are not looking to change that high need block by the result of changing our funding system. So I need to make that absolutely clear. Okay, next slide, which may or not be the last one. So just some key points. So where will I find the framework? Will it be published online? Andrea is our expert here, but as I understand it, once it's fully signed off, and it is in the very last stages of being signed off, it will go to design, and then it will be converted to HTML, and it will be accessible from the Hampshire local offer, but it will be a publicly available document. And I need to make that really clear. The banding values individually attached to EHCPs are subject to annual review. That doesn't mean the banding values overall, what we've allocated in terms of funding to the banding values will change each year. That means, like everything to do with EHCPs, they're subject to annual review. If a school tells us an annual review, and I'm coming back, I think, in July to update on where we are with the annual review plans, then a school is perfectly entitled to ask us to review the funding that's attached to that EHCP, as they are now, as they are in every local authority. So the duties on the county council to secure and arrange provision do not change. There's no change to any duties. All of the legislation remains exactly as it is. It's primarily the funding mechanism. Duties on schools remain as they are in terms of accountability, progress, attainment. All of those duties on a school level, they still remain exactly as they are. So next slide. Where are we now? What are our next steps? So we've got some training still to do. I have, and Andrea and I have run a series of awareness sessions for schools. There were 16 sessions across the county council. We are going to be 10 sessions down after this afternoon, which means we have 6 more sessions. And that's where we are making schools aware of the changes to the system and what they can expect with new EHCPs and existing EHCPs. There's work outside of this that I'm not on directly, but within the SEN service to continue to improve EHCPs. I'm really clear, and I hope I've been clear through the slides, that where a young person requires specific provisions and requires one-to-one, that's specified in the EHCP. So work continues to happen. We're very clear on the feedback that parents gave us through the consultation process about the wider issues in SEN. We absolutely heard those messages and are responding to those for a different work stream. Publishing the framework document once it's been to design and signed off. And then the last thing, which before I take questions, we're going to talk about this specifically after questions and how we engage you further in this process. We're developing an easy read version of the framework. Now, the framework itself, the introduction is very accessible. The language is accessible. We've made sure that we have absolutely minimized technical language and jargon, that we've made it really clear and straightforward, and it's accessible by anyone who needs to read that, whether that's schools, parents, educational psychologists, any services. So an awful lot of work has been done to make sure that it is accessible, but we're also producing an easy read version of that as well, a bit more visual based. The framework itself is technical in places by nature. Some provisions do and are described as being technical. There's a limit to what we can do with that, but overall we will be producing a second easy read version of the framework. And I think that then takes me to the end of the presentation.
Okay, Steve. As you would imagine, I've got lots of questions and I'm very conscious that time is moving swiftly on. So I think we ought to start cracking on with some of these and see how we get on. So let's see. Quick one about sort of funding and what happens. You've talked about how it shouldn't change the hours of one-to-one, but what about things like OT, SALT, other therapies? If a child is educated at home, don't think it applies for them, does it? But other activities that might happen outside of home but are specified in an EHCP, how does this change what happens to them?
Okay, so that's the first point, is this applies to young people who are educated in a school, and it's a mainstream school. So if a young person's not educated in a mainstream school, it doesn't apply, and this doesn't affect it in any way.
I think the question is referring potentially to a child who is educated in a mainstream school, but perhaps has something outside of school specified within their EHCP, which happens.
So it depends on two things. It depends on who's the responsible funder for that. So if it's funded through education, health, or social care, it's a very individualized question, and I wouldn't be able to go into that level of detail. But the other thing to consider as well is that parts of EHCP provision aren't delivered via top-up funding. So the question was around speech and language and occupational therapy. Local authorities, Hampshire, will have commissioning arrangements with providers and block contracts when it comes to things like therapies, and they are usually outside of top-up funding anyway. Okay.
Something that we get asked frequently: what has HCC done to ensure that EHCPs are now quantifiable and specific, so the EHCP provision is clear and enforceable? The reports are still full of access to, may benefit from.
Yeah, well, I said that this is a separate work stream that I'm not involved on, but what I did make really clear was that we listened very clearly to the feedback through the consultation. This was a constant thing that came up. If anybody read the final paper through consultation that went up for approval, even though this is not part of the banding framework consultation, we realised the significance enough that we put it in the paper. We acknowledged it as wider SEN issues that we needed to continue to work on. So alongside any work to do with banding, quality improvement and assurance is a separate work stream.
Okay. We have a child whose current setting agrees they should be in a special school, but Hampshire wants them to have their needs met in mainstream. So do things have to escalate for our child in mainstream before Hampshire will consider a move? And will the band be used as a criteria to decide if a move from mainstream to special school will be approved?
No, so the first part of the question is a bit outside of what I'm talking about today. But if a young person is in a mainstream school and their needs are greater than enhanced B, they're going to fall into our exceptional category anyway. So the banding framework isn't something that we use to determine suitability when it comes to school. That's an entirely separate legal process around consultation, suitability tests, etc. So the banding framework, it could be suggestive that a young person's needs are in the exceptional range, but that wouldn't be the way in which we determine that a special school is required.
So just to clarify, if a child wasn't in the exceptional band, that wouldn't prevent consideration of a move to special school?
The consideration of special school or any specialist provision is via the consultation process. It's not related to our banding framework.
Okay, thank you. You said that the SEN department are receiving training in July and August. When and what training will schools be receiving to support them in understanding how to translate bands into on-the-ground support?
So there's two parts to that. So I said that we've had 16 sessions that we've released through June, and school SENCOs, business managers and head teachers have come to these. Now there's a very clear distinction between what is an awareness session and what is training. The SEN service, generally when it comes to implementation of provision, expertise around SEND, that's not our area. We are in the business of assessing and writing EHCPs and the maintenance of EHCPs. When it comes to what happens on the ground and how schools implement, there's wider support networks. So whether that's through HIAS, Hampshire Inspection and Advisory Service, whether it's through their SEN advisors, whether it's through their SLA with their educational psychologists or any other service, when it comes to provision on the ground, that's outside of the SEN service.
I think the question comes about because one of the arguments for this change in the funding model is it gives the schools more flexibility. The thing is, the schools aren't used to more flexibility and perhaps need support in understanding how to use it.
Okay, I mean that is the answer. I mean, when it comes to how the funding mechanism works and what banding is all about and how the framework works, that's our responsibility. That's what we're getting out and doing. And that specifically comes up. So in one of the last slides, that question is, who do you go to for support? My answer is really clear with schools. If it's about the EHCP, if it's about banding as a concept, if it's about decisions and how we've come to decisions, that's the SEN service. If it's about implementation, it's not the SEN service. I'm not saying that there's no role for the county council in that. There is a role for the county council in that, whether it's through education psychology, HIAS, but essentially schools are responsible themselves for the implementation of SEN provision. In terms of flexibility, I mean, I can understand why the term flexibility raises anxieties. I've been around SEN long enough and worked with parents long enough to know that the message is EHCPs need to be absolutely clear and secure, and I get that. And when you introduce a term like flexibility, that does raise some anxieties. But EHCPs, whether we agree or not, they do always have a level of flexibility inside them. So an example could be if a young person requires a social skills program, then it's a social skills program. There is flexibility within that, how that school provides that. I've been in tribunals enough to know how very clearly how that works and what the law says on that. So there is always a level of flexibility when it comes to implementing an EHCP. What the banding framework does is it provides a very broad, wide range of provision that helps schools to do that. I mean, I take the point if schools are not used to doing that and they need support around that.
Just a couple of comments coming in I want to jump in with, because there a couple of comments just coming in from that discussion saying, yeah, totally get that, but ultimately the local authority is responsible for the delivering of the provision that's being delegated to schools on your behalf. So ultimately there is it's important for the LA to ensure that the schools are doing this right, otherwise the responsibility falls on your shoulders.
Yeah, no, guys, we're really clear on what the law says when it comes to securing and arranging provision, when it comes to EHCPs. And we're really clear on what's the duties on schools, where they are accountable. So banding is about the funding mechanism. And I've been really, really clear on how it actually works. I'm not going to get into a discussion about duties on local authorities and securing provision, because we're all really clear on that. We know it's the local authority's duty to secure that provision and ensure it happens and to keep that under review. But there is, regardless of, and we could debate this all day long, there is a layer of flexibility with some provisions when it comes to EHCPs.
Okay. I had a question that I now can't see that I thought would be a good one to pop in. Basically saying, will it be possible for people to see how many children in a school are on the different bands, because it gives parents an understanding of how much experience a school has in dealing with children with different levels of SEN?
Whether or not this was to do with banding, that would entirely be a decision for a school and not something that a local authority could or couldn't agree to. What goes on at a school level is entirely up to a school. However,
it is, I mean, currently you can find, for example,
Sarah, I need to finish my answers to give some full context. I know people have got lots of comments and questions, but I need to be able to give a full answer to these. What you might find with that is schools would be really reluctant around GDPR and if it would identify a particularly young person. But it's not an answer as a local authority we could give you. It's not something we could or couldn't authorise. Schools are largely autonomous. So when it comes to their own SEN and their own SEN arrangements, it's not an answer a local authority can give.
What I was going to say, because I think actually it adds context, is that actually you can find data on how many children in a school have an EHCP and how many children are on SEN support, which already gives you a little bit of that data. So I think people were just asking, would that be broken down further and be publicly available? I hear what you're saying about GDPR, that you're saying no, it wouldn't be necessarily publicly available.
No, I'm saying it wouldn't be an answer that a local authority could give. It would be entirely a decision for an individual school. Schools are largely autonomous when it comes to what goes on a daily basis in schools. Remember that our role, the local authority, is to assess, to produce that plan, to secure that provision, to maintain that plan.
Okay. little bit of a specialist one. If a child with an EHCP is decelerated by a year in order to support their social and emotional development as well as their academic development, will the banding be frozen for the additional year of the EHCP?
No, I don't. Why would it need to be?
I suppose what they're saying is that rather than go through that transition the year early, you actually go through the transition at the correct, at where they are academically rather than where they are in age. Does that make sense? Because they've gained an extra year in school, haven't they?
I mean, there's two parts to that. If it's about when they move when they move from hours of learning support assistance to banding, if it's the funding, it would be the key stage that they're in, because it would be when we would transition them. If it's about holding additional funding, because of financial years, schools can't keep money over a year, and local authorities don't release money retrospective over different years.
I think it's about, isn't it, that scenario where you have a child who by age is in year 6 but is in year 5, and you end up with that scenario where a child ends up with an additional year in school potentially.
I mean, same as it is now, we would still be funding them.
Okay.
They would still require funding now or through banding to deliver that provision. So, and
it may be that you know, that is the answer. Okay. You talked about caseworkers being able to flex things based on their knowledge of a child or young person. So if the funding moves from hours of learning to the nearest band, what happens if funding is rounded up or down? And is this a loss of just a few pounds or several hundreds or thousands of pounds?
Well, the first thing is the local authority are making the decision. So Hampshire County Council was saying this is the amount of funding that we feel is necessary to do that. Let me give you an example. I've been in another local authority who had an electronic resource allocation system, and a part of the assessment for this young person, and it came out and it recommended a particular band. Now, because I'd had some knowledge of that young person and the wider scenario with that young person, I disagreed with the recommendation, and we over provided to support that young person's transition into school. So when I say a caseworker has that ability to do that, yeah, if they look at what our system is recommending and they feel that actually that's probably not sufficient and there's a good reason for that, as they are now, they're perfectly able to say, well, I think we need to look at what we're providing, and that again would be rectified.
And I think the other part of the question is, what is the gaps between the bands? What are the steps like for funding? Is it a big jump to go from you know, the bottom one to, you know, or the middle one up to exceptional? Is there a lot of money involved between those bands?
Yeah, so the bands will range from 984 all the way up to 7999 at the top band as well. So that is a very big range. That's a broad range, you know. So we're looking at potentially a young person taking into account their elements 1 and 2. We're looking at a top up of 984 all the way up to 799. A question that I didn't put in the slide is there are some, very few, but some young people for who the top band it isn't sufficient. You know, there's something very, very specific, but we know who those young people are, and there's very specific reasons, costings, and evidence around why that would need to be, that additional funding would need to be there. I mean, that isn't an invitation to schools, and I'm making that clear to schools, to find some evidences and costs as to why that young person would go above that range. But I'm sure this question came up in the consultation. What if a young person, if their needs were higher than the exceptional band? But it's very evidence-based. I gave the example, if there was a young person who was in the mainstream school and for some interventions actually needed 3-to-1, that would be a very specific intervention. There would be evidence around that, and that would be costing. And we would need to consider within that context if it was required that we need to look at an additional amount. But these are real minority cases, and we know how many that there are.
This question sort of follows on from that, and it follows on from the flexibility. What risks have been identified around small schools pooling resources versus larger schools? On paper, it looks like children attending a smaller village school will be disadvantaged in this model, as their school wouldn't have enough plans in place to achieve the flexibility that should be the benefit of this model.
Well, I answered that really in the slides. I made a point of that by saying that That generally speaking isn't the case, but if that was the case, then again, as part of the assessment, there would be really clear evidence as to what would need to happen. If the only way that could be delivered attracted a very specific set of circumstances, we would have to look at that within the context individually.
Okay. Can you just clarify? I've got a question, which is what about phase transfers happening in September this year? So for young people who are moving into a new setting this year, your expectation is that they will be what, on banding?
No, they'll remain. We won't be ready this year. So this year the big focus is on new EHCPs coming out.
And you then said, let me just clarify so that I understand it and hopefully everybody else does too. So they're starting with new ones for people who applied after the 1st of April. Is that right?
Agreed. So
yeah. Okay, agreed after the 1st of April. And then they will be phased in over a 3-year period. But you also said, or at the next period of phase transition. So for example, if a child is just about to go into year 7, they've got 5 years before their next period of transition. So do they transfer over or not?
No, good point. Actually, I didn't mention that. That will be year 9 is the
okay.
At the moment. Yeah. So we wouldn't leave young people. It's for schools really. Schools wouldn't want to have 2 funding systems potentially running for 5 years. So and do keep in mind, and I hope I was really clear on that, this is a behind the scenes funding thing in terms of the funding run with school. So the big priority there with schools is how long that this system takes us to move over.
So
year 9 as well. So
it's 3 years or a transition, whichever comes first, isn't it? It's that way around.
When we think about the context of the entire service and what the SEN service has to do, what we don't want to do is we don't want to give ourselves additional amendments that don't need to be done purely because of banding. So young people will have their plans amended for phase transfer anyway. So that's the natural time to do this piece of work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's the same as when we transition from statements to EHCPs. My daughter has just transitioned into year 3 in September and has 32.5 hours of support. Would it be a fair assumption that she is considered to have the highest needs and would be in the exceptional band?
More than likely.
Okay. I have got, unsurprising, and I've left them to the end, lots of comments about the fact that isn't this just a way of cutting SEND funding? Will this mean less money for SEND? How do we know that the money will be increased or there'll be an increase in banding values year on year? As you can imagine, there's lots of skepticism. So can you give us some reassurance?
I hope I have. I dedicated a lot of time in the slide about funding and talking about the high needs block budget not being impacted on this and schools SEN notional budgets not being impacted on this. There are no covert plans to put people down a band. None of that exists. We're really clear on the framework, and the framework is a public document. So you will be able to see where we've placed the young person as well. So it's out there, it's transparent. I've worked in SEN local authorities long enough to understand the skepticism. I understand that, but I have been really, really clear in that band that this isn't a cost-saving exercise. They are 2 budgets that are not impacted on by changing the mechanism by which we pay schools money.
I mean, I think people's concern is that whilst it might not change the funding their child gets now, there might not be an increase in funding going forward. And I think, you know, when people are looking at the fact that Hampshire's completion of EHCPs within the 20-week deadline isn't great at the moment, people are just feeling vulnerable, I suppose. Okay, I think I've almost got through everything. I've just got one sort of talking about schools and what the feedback was from schools about the banding, and did they have concerns?
I mean, well, 94% of the schools that took part in the survey were really positive about both the banding values themselves, but banding as a concept. I mean, we did say this in consultation, and I've reassured schools of this. Banding isn't a new concept that Hampshire has come up with. It is the way in which most local authorities work. When it comes to complaints and concerns, Usually they're about the content of the plan, the implementation of the plan, and how often the local authority amends that plan. The mechanism by which schools are paid, in my experience of there's never been a specific complaint about that. Parents are unfortunately sometimes put in a position where schools will influence them to say the funding isn't sufficient. But that's not a position that we encourage, because parents don't have any influence over that. It's a financial decision between the local authority and the school. And if the school is of the impression that it's not sufficient, the school will tell us that, I assure you, and we'll expect them to evidence as to why they don't think it's sufficient. But parents shouldn't be put in that position, because you cannot directly influence the funding that we make available to schools.
So schools are happy with this new system? Yeah. Okay, I think going back to the thing about people holding schools accountable, I think what makes people nervous is they were able to hold schools accountable when they knew what they should be seeing on the ground. And I think the nervousness around banding is that they can't see what they should be looking to see. That's really badly explained by me, but I think people, if you want something to be specific and quantified, you knew what you were looking for. Is with banding you don't. And I think somebody else has asked me what the feedback was from parents on banding, and I know that was something that came up a lot. How has the feedback from parents been addressed and built into what we're doing going forwards?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways. So I explained that in the consultation document itself, when we took it for final agreement, we were open and transparent about the consultation responses, and we broke down where parents had raised concerns, whether it was about a banding or whether it was about the wider SEN issues. Now, when we did an analysis of parents' feedback through consultation, less than 20% of the concerns that were raised were about the banding mechanism. They were about the wider SEN issues and the things that you've just spoke about, whether it's about the quality of EHCPs, whether it's about quantification or specification, or whether it's implementation and accountability at schools. But that wasn't the banding framework. So, 80% of those concerns were not directly related to the banding framework. But either way, we were transparent in the messages that went up, and they're all, again, publicly available documents. What I would say, just to go back to the first point of that, we understand that. Even before going through consultation, we understood that the concern for parents is about how EHCPs or SEN support in general is implemented at a school level, and understanding that one of the ways school parents do hold schools to account was through hours of learning support assistance. But that was part of the issue. It wasn't. It was the wrong thing being held to account. What was being put in and the progress that kids were making, that's the measurement. How, if young people are receiving their support and they are making progress against their outcomes, that's the measurement. That's what we're looking at. When we had a system of hours of learning support assistant and you were under the impression that your son or daughter was getting 25 hours of one-to-one, you weren't necessarily. That was part of the confusion around the support systems. So there is accountability, there is conversations that you have with schools, but it's not. We do need to make sure that it's not only input, it needs to be about progress, and that's what we sometimes miss in SEN. And I know all the reasons why, I support all the reasons why, I've had lots of those conversations, but that's what we want to be seeing. It's about progress. What impact is all of this making?
I think it's just indicative, isn't it, of concerns. And if parents weren't concerned, then the change wouldn't be a concern. I think it's indicative of the fact that they have concerns anyway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the chat at the end. You did a very good frequently asked questions document after we did all the banding consultations, and it's got a huge amount of detail and answer to a lot of questions. So what I'll do is I'll pop that in the chat, the link to that in the chat for everybody to have a look at if they want to at their leisure. Now, I'm aware time is moving swiftly on. I have been through all the questions that I've got, I think, that have come through. What do you want to do next?
Andrew, should we arrange a separate session? Because I'm conscious we've
yeah, I think possibly what I could do, Sarah, is just leave some thoughts for people to start having a think about. And then maybe we could arrange a separate session. Unfortunately, I've got something at 12:15, so maybe if I just share the last slide, and it's something that we're very keen on, because Steve mentioned that we would be producing an easy read version of the banding framework document, and in there, share my screen, hopefully you guys can see this. Hopefully that's come up okay. So what we want to do is we want to ask for some help in developing the easy read version of the parent communication. The banding framework is what it is, it's a technical document. So to actually make that easier to understand, and also some of the other areas which parents want to see, I was wondering if we could have some feedback and some discussion, so maybe we could have a smaller separate session on this. And I've put this down into due journey. So if you're a new parent, i.e. a parent who is just about to go through that process of applying for an EHC assessment, what is it that you would want to know? What does that look like for you? If you're actually a parent of a child with an existing EHCP, and I've taken away a lot of information from today, because obviously the questions give me some of that insight into what you would like to know. So there's a little bit of a parent journey going on here, and it's how we can do some communication to help that parent journey. What is it parents would like to know? What do you need to know? What is it that you don't currently have access to that you'd like to know, or might be a little bit too technical? We'll do some explanation around the 4 areas which Steve was saying about earlier that are in the banding framework, and the levels. How would you like to receive that information? Do you want it in a portal somewhere that you can link into? Do you want some printed copies of it? We're going to make it available through schools. So actually, it really is to help to guide parents. And the last bit about this is this piece particularly is about us working together so that we can ensure that the document we produce is useful to parents, and it's not just Hampshire saying, here you go parents, this is for you. We actually want to have some input that actually makes it useful in the right way for parents with children who either have EHCPs or potentially may be going through that process.
That sounds like a huge question there, Andrea.
I think what I was going to do was just do a bit of brainstorming, so it was really sort of like fast answers, really quick reactions to it, because that's very much the way we can start this type of work. So maybe people just want to have a think. Maybe they could just drop your notes, Sarah, which you could send on to me, so I can start to just get a little bit of an idea, and then I can
feel free to pick comments in the chat, folks, and I'll pass them on.
And then I
think that is such a huge thing that we could probably all write dissertations about. It is massive, and I think one of the challenges is parents don't know what they need to know, and that is one of the biggest challenges. So they can't answer the question because they don't know.
That's fine, and that's really useful. So actually we can say, we'll include some of this, and you might say, actually, we don't need to know that. So there'll be a little bit of toing and froing on this, but I think it's a really good exercise so that we can understand what you do want to know, and maybe the gaps that you don't actually know what you want to know. So please just send me the chat. Happy to read that stuff, so that next time we sit down and look at this, I can actually bring a little bit more focus into the comments that you've shared with me.
I've just got a comment from Gail Moyer, who's on. So I'll just saying, maybe we could do something with Sendias and have a team that come together and facilitate something. So that might be worth doing, because it's huge. It's absolutely huge. That it's not a simple Simple answer.
No, I guess originally the first piece of this is obviously around the banding framework, and the explanation of what is the framework, what does that look like, how does that relate to the provision, the top-up funding. So there is a specific piece, but we do appreciate there are wider pieces as well.
Yeah. Yes, I'm just kind of, I just know how big that thing is as a parent. You know, it's just huge. So I think it would be a good idea to do something at a separate time, and possibly to ensure that we've got people across different stages, because it's a very different experience applying for an EHCP. If in my scenario, for example, I knew my daughter had a diagnosis and we needed an EHCP for school, to start school, that's very different to somebody who doesn't know before they get to school, and the experience is happening when they're in school. So there's lots of different stages of this journey, and I think, you know, therefore different people need to know different things just to confuse it, and it's very complex. Okay, shall we leave that for another day?
Yeah, if we can help to strip it back and put some quality information around it, then that would be really good.
I'm sure there will be people will be happy to share, you know, how they feel on it for you, and perhaps have an opportunity to think about it before they come to a session.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you.
Super. Thanks for your time, guys. We've covered quite a lot of ground. We have recorded the session, so we will be able to put effectively the slides with Steve's commentary will go up, and we will share that via our social media channels and so on. Anything to add, Steve? I see you've unmuted yourself there.
No, I think that's it. That's been a really helpful session. You know, as I'd say the same to you guys as I do to schools. You know, these are helpful conversations to have. These are helpful questions to have. You know, we have done our very best to A, think about this in great detail, B, respond to what you told us in the consultation, and take on board those concerns and the practicalities of it. But, you know, we know we don't know absolutely everything, so these sessions are really valuable to us, and we welcome those questions.
Super. Thank you both for your time. Thank you for all those parents who've attended, because it was really important to have the voice of parents, you know, and for Steve and Andrew, and to be able to take that back to HCC and with, you know, as that voice. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come as well. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording, and I've just got to do a little bit of admin, and then I will leave the meeting and close it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.